Alien cadets stunned by human Deathworlders' combat drills. You want us to do what? Cadet Rilvek's 3 eyelids blinked out of sync as he stared at the human instructor. Around him, the other alien cadets, recruits from across the Galactic Dominion's most elite training academies, shifted nervously. Commander Elias Grant folded his arms, his earthborn frame towering over most of the recruits. He wore a simple combat uniform, sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms crisscrossed with scars. His expression was unreadable, but the flicker of amusement in his green eyes suggested he was enjoying this far more than he should. I said, he repeated, voice steady as stone, you're going to spar with me. One-on-one. Full contact. No weapons. A hush fell over the cadet formation. Rilvek's tail coiled in unease, his species equivalent of a nervous gulp. Even the heavily armored Vrax warrior, standing a full foot taller than the human, let out a guttural clicking sound, uncertain, perhaps even afraid. Rilvek had heard the rumors. Everyone in the Dominion had. Humans were a Deathworld species, a rare, terrifying anomaly in galactic evolution. Their home planet, Earth, was an unstable hellscape teeming with apex predators, natural disasters, and unrelenting competition for survival. By all logic, they shouldn't exist. Yet here one stood, smiling. The cadets weren't cowards. They had trained in war simulations, studied strategy, and learned to wield plasma rifles and shock blades. But this? Hand-to-hand combat with a human? It felt suicidal. A mechanical chime echoed through the training arena. The automated system had accepted Grant's command. The sparring session was set. The commander cracked his neck. Who's first? Unbreakable bond forming. Silence. No one moved. Then, after an agonizing pause, a hulking reptilian cadet stepped forward. I will fight. Rilvek turned in disbelief. Zelver was a Drenkar, a species evolved from carnivorous apex hunters. His emerald-green scales rippled as he flexed his claws. His species' regenerative abilities meant he could survive injuries that would cripple others. If anyone had a chance against a human, it was him. Commander Grant grinned. Good. Let's see what you've got. The cadets scrambled back, forming a wide ring. The floor pulsed as the arena's shield systems activated, ensuring none of the spectators would be harmed. Zelver crouched low, tail lashing. His species was known for explosive bursts of speed. His plan was obvious: overwhelm the human before he had a chance to react. The chime rang. Begin. Zelver lunged. A blur of motion. Then, crack. The sound of impact was sickening. One moment, Zelver had launched forward with the speed of a striking viper. The next, he was hurtling through the air, spinning uncontrollably before slamming into the ground hard enough to rattle the floor. Rilvek's brain short-circuited. What? Zelver groaned, rolling onto his side. His massive chest heaved. He looked disoriented. His reptilian eyes darted around, searching for something that made sense. Grant hadn't even moved from his original position. He was relaxed. I see your people rely on speed, he mused, cracking his knuckles. Not bad. But predictable. Zelver let out a snarl, pushing himself up, only for Grant to close the distance in an instant. The human moved like a storm. His leg came up, a spinning arc of motion, a kick. It struck Zelver square in the chest. The reptilian cadet's body lifted off the ground and smashed against the shielded walls with a deafening boom. Zelver crumpled. Unconscious. Dead silence. Rilvek's hearts pounded. Zelver had been the strongest among them. And he had lasted seconds. Grant exhaled, shaking out his limbs as if he'd just finished a warm-up jog. He glanced at the remaining cadets, raising an eyebrow. Next. Cliffhanger ending. Rilvek's instincts screamed run. This wasn't training, this was survival. But before he could react, another cadet stepped forward. A Vrax warborn. A giant. He removed his armor plates, revealing thick, obsidian-like hide. His species was renowned for brute strength. Even unarmed, a Vrax warrior could tear through steel. He clenched his 4 fists, tusks bared. I accept. Grant smiled. Good. Another chime. Round 2. The Vrax charged. This time the human moved first. And the moment he struck, everything changed. The Vrax warrior's charge was earth-shaking. He moved like a collapsing mountain, 4 massive arms pumping, tusks gleaming in the overhead lights. His species didn't rely on speed or agility. They relied on raw power, the kind that had shattered battlefronts and made them the Dominion's most feared shock troopers. His plan was obvious: get close. Grapple. Crush. No being, no species, could withstand a full-strength Vrax bear hug. Rilvek's hearts pounded as the brute closed in. The first blow came in a wide, sweeping arc, a strike strong enough to cave in reinforced plating. It never landed. Grant wasn't there anymore. He had moved, so fast that Rilvek's eyes struggled to track him. One moment he stood relaxed. The next he had ducked low, pivoting around the Vrax's outstretched arm with a grace no one that size should have. The Vrax barely had time to adjust before. Crack. Grant's elbow drove into the warrior's ribs with terrifying precision. The sound that followed was not just impact, it was something breaking. The warrior bellowed in pain, stumbling forward from his own momentum. Grant didn't let him recover. He twisted, slamming his knee into the Vrax's side, targeting the same damaged spot. The warrior buckled. A third strike, this time a brutal downward fist to the back of the neck, sent the giant crashing to the floor. The training arena shook. Rilvek couldn't breathe. The Vrax groaned trying to rise. His forearms braced against the floor, shaking with effort. But Grant had already moved behind him. With a single leap, the human landed on the warrior's back. His arms snaked around the Vrax's throat. A chokehold. The cadets gasped. Impossible. No one choked out a Vrax. Their thick hide and sheer muscle mass made such tactics worthless. But something was happening. The Vrax's struggles were slowing. His thrashing turned sluggish. His arms weakened. His roars faded into labored wheezes. His body collapsed. Unconscious. Grant exhaled, releasing his grip. He rolled off the Vrax's back as if stepping off a piece of gym equipment. Silence. The human stood relaxed. Then he turned to face them. Who's next? Escalating stakes. No one moved. This wasn't just combat training anymore. This was something else. Rilvek's brain was still reeling. Zelver had been fast. The Vrax had been strong. Yet neither had lasted more than seconds. Was this what Deathworlders were truly capable of? One by one, cadets took a step back. Grant sighed, rolling his shoulders. That's a shame. Rilvek swallowed hard. He knew what would come next. He knew what he had to do. Before his body could catch up with his brain, his feet stepped forward. His voice, God's help him, spoke. I'll fight. Grant turned. His green eyes locked onto him. The moment stretched, longer than it should have. Then, to Rilvek's surprise, the human smiled. Not a mocking grin. Not the condescending smirk he had worn with the others. Something else. Good, Grant said. The automated chime signaled the third match. Gut-wrenching moments. Rilvek's muscles screamed at him to flee. But it was too late. The human had already moved. Rilvek braced for an attack, but it never came. Grant wasn't charging. Wasn't striking. He was circling him. Studying. Rilvek's tail flicked in agitation. He took a step back, forcing himself into a low stance. His people, Xylithians, were agile, precise fighters. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but calculating. They relied on prediction. Reading movement. Analyzing patterns. Striking only when the moment was perfect. Grant gave nothing away. Rilvek feinted left, trying to force a reaction. The human didn't flinch. He tried again, shifting his weight forward, preparing a kick. Still nothing. Why isn't he attacking? A bead of sweat rolled down Rilvek's temple. His fingers twitched. He had studied Dominion battle tactics for years, yet this was unlike anything he had trained for. No battle stance. No openings. Just relaxed control. Then, in a flicker of movement, Grant twitched. It was so small Rilvek nearly missed it. A shift in weight. A slight pivot. His brain screamed. Now. He moved. His tail whipped forward, his fastest attack. A blur of motion aimed at the human's unguarded side. For a split second he thought it had worked. Then pain. Somehow, impossibly, Grant had caught his tail mid-strike. With one hand. Rilvek choked back a cry. The grip was like iron. And then he was flying. Grant yanked. The world spun as Rilvek felt his feet leave the ground. His body twisted through the air before he slammed onto the floor, hard enough to rattle his bones. Stars burst behind his eyes. He gasped. His limbs wouldn't respond. He tried to move, but Grant was already there. A hand pressed lightly against his throat. A signal. If this were real, you'd be dead. Rilvek froze. The human leaned in. His voice was calm. What did you learn? His lungs burned. His vision swam. Yet, despite everything, the answer came instantly. I never had a chance. Grant smiled. Good. And then, he stood, offering a hand. Rilvek hesitated, then took it. The human pulled him to his feet effortlessly. The other cadets stared in shock. Not just at Rilvek. At Grant. Because unlike before, this time the human had shown mercy. And that was when the real lesson hit him. This wasn't about winning. This was about understanding. Understanding why humanity was feared. But more importantly, why they didn't have to be. Unexpected twist and cliffhanger. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't humiliation. It was realization. Before today they had all heard stories about Deathworlders. Now they understood. Grant sighed, stretching. All right. That's enough for today. The training AI deactivated the combat protocols. The shields fell. The cadets remained frozen. Then quietly someone started clapping. A single slow clap. Then another. Then another. Until the room erupted into thunderous applause. Rilvek turned to see who had started it. His breath caught. It was the Dominion officers. The elite instructors. The war-hardened generals who had been silently observing. They were clapping for the human. Grant sighed. Well, that's new. Then his comm chimed. A single message. From high command. Change of plans. You're being reassigned. Grant's smirk faded. His gaze darkened. Something big was coming. And this was just the beginning. Grant stared at the message flashing on his comm. The cheering from the cadets dimmed into background noise as his mind processed the implications. Reassignment. He had expected resistance. Skepticism. Even outright dismissal of his methods. But applause? And now this? Something was wrong. He turned, locking eyes with the senior Dominion officers standing along the edge of the arena. Their expressions were unreadable, but their silence spoke volumes. Rilvek, still catching his breath from their sparring match, followed his gaze. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow. Commander? Grant didn't answer. Instead, he dismissed the notification with a flick of his wrist and stepped forward. All right, he said, his voice carrying through the massive training hall. Debrief time. The cadets snapped to attention. You all did well. Grant's eyes swept over the recruits, Zelver still rubbing his chest where the human had struck him, the Vrax warrior slowly regaining consciousness with a groggy growl, and Rilvek standing with his tail coiled in thought. You lost, yes, Grant continued, but that's not what matters. What matters is that you learned something today. And not just about combat. He let the words sink in before continuing. The Dominion has fought wars for centuries. You pride yourselves on discipline, tactics, and overwhelming firepower. His gaze hardened. But that's not enough. It never was. The silence deepened. Wars aren't won by muscle alone. Not by sheer numbers. Not even by the strongest technology. He exhaled. Wars are won by adaptation. By those who learn faster than their enemies. And if today taught you anything, he smirked, it's that humans learn fast. A few uneasy chuckles. Others remained rigid, processing what had just happened. Then the voice of authority cut through the air. You've made your point, Commander Grant. The applause ceased instantly. The Dominion officers stepped forward. The lead officer, a towering Kethrian with dark blue skin and piercing silver eyes, regarded Grant with a calculating expression. You have been reassigned, she said, her voice smooth but firm. You will leave immediately. Grant raised an eyebrow. Reassigned to where, exactly? The Kethrian handed him a data pad. The front. A ripple of shock ran through the cadets. The front. Rilvek repeated before he could stop himself. The officer barely spared him a glance. Why? Grant asked, scanning the data pad. His expression darkened. A situation has developed, the officer said carefully. Your particular skills are required. Rilvek's tail flicked. Something wasn't right. I'll need details, Grant said, crossing his arms. The Kethrian hesitated. Just for a second. Then she said something that changed everything. The Xyrix swarm has returned. Worst case scenario. The training hall turned to ice. Rilvek's body went rigid. He saw it, the reaction, the barely restrained terror flashing through the cadets and officers alike. The swarm. Whispers spread like wildfire. They were destroyed. No, this can't be. Grant, to his credit, didn't react. Not at first. He simply rolled his shoulders, exhaling through his nose. Then he smiled. A small, sharp smile. The bugs are back, huh? The Kethrian's gaze remained unreadable. Yes. The Xyrix swarm, a nightmare-given form. A race of biomechanical horrors that had nearly wiped out 3 Dominion sectors before they vanished without a trace. No diplomacy, no reasoning. Just pure, relentless consumption. And now they were back. I take it, Grant said, tapping the datapad, that the Dominion's usual tactics aren't working? Silence. Then, no. Grant's smirk widened. Thought so. A glimmer of hope. Rilvek's mind raced. The swarm's return was a death sentence for entire systems. The Dominion had barely held them off before. But this time they had something different. They had a human. I assume, Grant continued, glancing at the officer, that I won't be going alone? The Kethrian's silver eyes flickered. No, she gestured toward the cadets. They're going with you. Rilvek's blood ran cold. What? The decision has been made. The Kethrian's voice was final. These cadets will deploy as your unit. You will train them on the battlefield. The implications hit like a plasma round. They were recruits. Cadets who had just begun to understand what true combat was. And now they were being thrown into war. The cadets knew it too. Rilvek saw it on their faces. The fear. The uncertainty. Zelver's claws flexed. We aren't ready. Grant's voice cut through the tension like a blade. You never are. Silence. Then he turned and smiled. But you will be. And somehow, Rilvek almost believed him. The animal's truth revealed. The transport ship rumbled beneath their feet. They were already en route. No time for hesitation. No time for fear. The cadets were tense, gripping their restraints as the ship hurtled through FTL. Even the Vrax warrior, normally unshakable, seemed unnerved. Grant, meanwhile, was relaxed. Seated across from them, arms folded, boots resting on the floor like he was settling in for a casual ride. Rilvek couldn't take it anymore. What's the plan? He asked. Grant exhaled. Survive. That's not a plan. Zelver snapped. That's. Grant leaned forward, his gaze suddenly sharp. No. That's the only plan that matters. Silence. Then he continued. The swarm doesn't play by your rules. They don't care about your tactics. They don't fear your weapons. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. But they can be beaten. Rilvek's tail twitched. How? Grant smiled. We show them why Deathworlders don't die easy. The ship shuddered. They had arrived. The comm crackled. Brace for deployment, hostile contact imminent. Red warning lights flashed across the cabin. The cadets stiffened. Rilvek's pulse hammered. Then, a sound. A deep, inhuman chittering. It echoed through the hull. They were waiting. Grant rolled his shoulders, standing. Time to work, cadets. The doors hissed open. And the swarm descended. The ramp slammed down. A wave of heat and the stench of burning metal hit them like a shockwave. Outside, the battlefield was hell itself. A sky choked with smoke and tracer fire. Explosions rippling through the shattered ruins of a Dominion outpost. And the swarm. Thousands. They moved like a living tide, a writhing mass of blackened chitin and pulsating bioluminescent veins. Multi-limbed horrors, their exoskeletons armored like battleships, screeching in a frequency that made bones vibrate. The cadets froze. Even the Vrax warrior, an apex predator in his own right, let out a low, instinctive growl as the horde advanced. Rilvek couldn't move. The stories hadn't done them justice. The swarm were monsters. Then Grant stepped forward. Completely at ease. No hesitation. No fear. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his knuckles, and smiled. All right, kids, he said. Lesson 2. Then he jumped. Straight off the ramp. Into the swarm. The most intense battle of their lives. The cadets screamed. Commander. But Grant was already gone. A blur of movement, fists, and sheer violence. He hit the ground in a crouch, rolling between the snapping mandibles of a swarm warrior. The beast lunged, but Grant was faster. His fist rocketed up, a single brutal uppercut, and met reinforced chitin. The shell cracked. The swarm warrior reeled, its monstrous shriek cut short as Grant grabbed its mandibles and ripped. A sickening crunch. The creature collapsed, twitching as black ichor sprayed across Grant's chest. The battlefield went still. Even the swarm hesitated. For a fraction of a second, thousands of alien predators collectively processed what had just happened. And Grant, just a human, just flesh and bone, grinned up at them. Come on then, he growled, raising his fists. Let's dance. The swarm charged. And Grant met them head-on. Cadets enter the fight. Rilvek's paralysis shattered. Geo, he roared. The cadets moved. They leapt from the transport, weapons blazing. Plasma rounds ripped into the horde, burning through the first wave of creatures. Explosions ripped limbs apart, but the swarm kept coming, undeterred, relentless. Grant was still in the thick of it, dodging razor-clawed limbs, countering impossibilities. A swarm brute lunged. Grant ducked, rolled, came up behind it and drove a combat knife into the exposed seam of its neck. The creature convulsed violently. He yanked the blade free and kept moving. Rilvek fought his own battle, instinct screaming. He shot down 1, 2, 3 swarm warriors. Zelver fought at his side, his usual arrogance gone. His shots were precise, focused. The Vrax warrior tore into the enemy with brute force, his claws slicing through hardened carapace. And yet, it wasn't enough. More kept coming. The swarm was endless. For every one that fell, 10 more replaced it. Then they adapted. A new wave of creatures emerged, thicker armor, different attack patterns. Rilvek's shots started glancing off uselessly. The cadets' formations began to falter. They were going to be overrun. Then Grant shouted, "Watch me!" The turning point. He grabbed a fallen swarm corpse, ripped free a jagged, biometallic limb, and hurled it like a spear. It skewered one of the advancing creatures through its glowing eye. The thing convulsed, screaming. Then, Grant was in motion. He wasn't just fighting them. He was studying them. Adapting. Where their joints moved, how their limbs twitched before a strike. He began exploiting the patterns of their attack cycles, using their own instincts against them. A step left, dodge. A crouch, counter. A feint, strike. And suddenly he wasn't the one reacting. The swarm was. And they were losing. The cadets saw it. And, one by one, they mimicked him. They stopped panicking. Stopped reacting. And started fighting like Grant. Rilvek ducked under a swarm warrior's strike and slammed a plasma blade into the weak spot Grant had exposed. Zelver stopped aiming for the chest armor and started shooting the leg joints. The Vrax ripped a limb off one creature, and used it to cave in another's skull. The swarm realized too late. The cadets weren't just holding their ground anymore. They were winning. The final stand. The last wave of swarm warriors surged forward, one final desperate push. Grant exhaled, rolling his shoulders. All or nothing, he muttered. Then for the first time he drew his gun. A massive hand cannon loaded with high explosive rounds. He leveled it at the incoming horde, and fired. The first shot detonated an entire swarm warrior. The second took out another. And then he was moving, weapon in one hand, combat knife in the other. The cadets pushed with him, one last charge, one final push. The battlefield became chaos. Flashes of light. Blood. Screams. Then, a final explosion. A shockwave. And then silence. The dust settled. The swarm was dead. The battle was over. The emotional payoff. For a moment no one moved. Then, a ragged cheer. The cadets looked around in disbelief. They had survived. They had won. Rilvek turned. Grant stood among the wreckage, wiping swarm ichor from his face. He looked satisfied. Then he clapped once. "All right," he said. Lesson 3. The cadets straightened instinctively. Grant smirked. "Next time we do it without me saving your asses." Laughter. Relief. A sense of pride. Rilvek realized something then. They weren't just cadets anymore. They were warriors. Because they had learned from a Deathworlder. A human. And no enemy in the galaxy would ever forget it. The end.